Hello everyone, it's been a year, so it's time to really piss some people off. It's time for a tier list. I know most people skip to the end to see the entire thing, though if you want to go back to listen what I have to say about some of the characters, just know I went in order from top to bottom. A few things before we start. This is my personal experience with combat in general. I don't want you to think this is some objective truth or anything like this. A list like this probably doesn't even exist, so you will guaranteed have different opinions on at least some characters, and that's perfectly fine. Next, I also don't like to go with the usual S to F tier format, because let's be honest, everybody has a different idea on how to actually interpret that. In other words, I want to avoid the good old everything that isn't S tier sucks situation. Must pull. Let's be honest, you can clear 99% of the game with your Traveler alone, but I didn't know what ads to call this tier. I just feel like there are a handful of characters in a league of their own, so this was kind of needed. The first one is Raiden. At this point, I feel like I don't have to talk too much about her. Super versatile, insane utility, laughably easy to play while also having good personal damage. Usually, characters fall into one or the other category, high utility or DPS, so when they do both, it's obviously a little special. Raiden also has synergy with a lot of 4-star characters, or to use my favorite cope term, she is free to play friendly. Best character in the game. Nahida, by far the best Dendro character, she has great build diversity with the choice between pure DPS or very focused on elemental mastery to complement her burst skill, which makes her very accessible. And a lot of the positives are already mentioned about Raiden, very versatile, great utility, easy to play, while also having great damage, especially against multiple targets. Xiangling, she hasn't changed, it's still the best pyro DPS since the game launched. This almost feels like an accident after seeing characters like Toma or Dia being released, so chances that we will ever get a pyro sub DPS dealing more damage than Xiangling are close to zero in my opinion, and there's absolutely no chance for that to be a 4-star. She's also fairly easy to play, her burst skill snapshotting is all you need to pay attention to, which means you only need to be somewhat mindful of rotations. Ayaka, best cryo DPS, especially together with jungling. She has insane single target burst damage potential, meaning her team's damage spikes up like crazy in the beginning of the fight and then it falls off hard until your skills are off cooldown again. She is an absolute boss killer, in other words. But I feel like Ayaka is starting to fall off a little bit in Abyss. At this point, there are a few bosses that either straight up survive that little combo or don't offer an early opening to just get one shot at all. Also, again, I don't believe there will be another jungling in the future to open up other Ayaka melt teams. At the end of Fontaine, I can see a world of Ayaka dropping down one tier, assuming the encounter design will go in a similar direction. Especially since her second option is Freeze, which doesn't work at all against bosses, so something like a Blizzard Strayer Ayaka doesn't feel super viable to me. And I don't see the release of the Hydro region changing that. But to be fair, bosses surviving longer than 10 seconds doesn't make her bad, it just means that Ayaka teams are more in line with other ones if the downtime after the initial burst window is actually relevant. Yelan, again a character with both high utility and even more damage. Also, she is an HP scaling emblem set character, which is great since she doesn't have to compete with all the attack scaling characters using the same set. In general, Hydra to me feels like the most impactful element these days. You almost need it for anything like Vaporize, Freeze, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, Burgeon, you name it. This again makes Yelan also fairly versatile in kind of a different way. Her burst skill as main source of Yelan's damage is conditional on normal attacks, which is the main thing to keep her in check. If she didn't have that restriction, like Raiden's elemental skill for example, Yelan would be a little too oppressive, so I don't even consider it a big downside. One thing though is, she has a fairly high skill ceiling with her dynamic damage buff. This is especially noticeable with skills that snapshot, pressing Yelan's and jungling's burst skills back to back obviously is bad, so having Yelan in your team might majorly impact your rotations. Moving on to top tier, these are still our great characters, and I think in most cases picking them up will still feel like a noticeable upgrade to your account. The differentiating factor to the tier above is, in some cases, playstyle preference, bigger team restrictions, weaker synergies as of now, or straight up not being the best at whatever they are meant to do. First, we have Jing Shou. He is basically the 4-star equivalent to Yelan. His personal damage is a little lower, but his utility is kind of comparable. He doesn't provide the damage buff, but in turn, the rotating rain swords around your active character provide extra hydro application, which in some situations might actually make him the better choice. Ganyu, I already talked a lot about Ayaka, who I would still consider the best cryo main DPS. The difference between the two is still the same. Ganyu is a hyper carry and in my opinion the best one in the game. Incredibly high consistent damage, and if in the future we can't one-shot everything with Ayaka anymore, I can see a world where consistent damage might actually be the way to go and Ganyu moving back up to be the best cryo DPS once again. Sucrose. I made a whole video about Sucrose and Kazuha. In my opinion, they are incredibly close. I just feel like Sucrose is slightly more versatile nowadays with her Elemental Mastery buff. Also, Sucrose can be used on field. She is clearly ahead in any team using transformative reactions and spread damage. Melt and Vaporize are pretty even. As for Kazuha, right next to her, there are some aggravate teams you can build that clearly favor Kazuha, but if you use characters like Nahida, obviously the gap closes again. The teams in which Kazuha is unquestionably ahead are only about mono element damage like Freeze or mono Electro. To be fair, Kazuha is also a little smoother to play though. Again, all of these things make them feel really close, at least to me, and that's how it is reflected in this list. Also, this doesn't influence my decision here, but Kazuha might have some of the best early constellations. He is a little paid to win. At C2, it is basically a whole different character. Venti, he is the oldest limited character, but no matter how many new characters they release, he probably won't care. Mainly, he doesn't care about your team synergy, but more about the enemy lineup. If you fight big groups, he feels like the best character in the game. Against a single target, he feels pretty weak, so this is the compromise. Zhongli, at the end of Inazuma, I put him way lower and a lot of people were furious, but I didn't really see anything convincing. And then Dendro Reactions released. He gained a lot, where I would actually put him as the best healer slash utility character sustaining your team. The problem? Geo is still terrible, since in terms of team synergy it only synergizes with itself after the Geo Resonance rework. Geo elemental reactions are still garbage, and picking up a single Geo character feels pretty much always bad. His personal damage is still not very impressive, the animation on his burst skill is way too long for that. The saving grace though, there are a lot of shields to break nowadays, the one thing Geo is good at. Also, a lot of teams nowadays aren't really about hyper carries anymore and have their damage kind of equally spread out over multiple DPS characters. Having resistance shred to all elements simultaneously with the press of a button is great. Most enemies also are around 10 resistance, so Zhongli is barely experiencing diminishing returns from negative resistances like a lot of other sources for resistance shred. Bennett, he is kind of the exact opposite of Zhongli. His utility only affects the on-field character, so mainly attack scaling hyper carries, which are getting a little rare to be fair. There are still a lot of snapshotting skills though, like Ayaka's burst skill, Ayato's, or of course Zhangling's, who are used to justify Bennett's fairly high placement. Snapshotting, Pyro Resonance, and Zhangling definitely needs a battery if you want any damage stats on her. Bennett almost feels like a prerequisite for playing that character. Kokomi, the last one of my little healer sustainer trio here. This character came a long way since her release. She kind of started as a $100 Barbara alternative because there wasn't really a big need for large area hydro application. Now with a bigger character roster and the Bloom Elemental Reaction group, Kokomi is in a really good place though. Ayato, just a very solid character. He is surprisingly versatile. Obviously, he can be a main DPS focusing on his elemental skill, but you can also use him as a sub DPS with high energy recharge on the emblem set. His burst skill is really good damage, it snapshots and covers a huge area. Fischl, on this one, I actually changed my mind fairly recently. I always thought she was pretty good in Sumeru. Obviously, aside from taser teams, Electro sub-DPS characters also added Aggravate to their repertoire, which gives them more gameplay variety, but it's also just very simple and strong, especially for Fischl, who is basically just there for her Raven. Yai Miko. I already alluded to this when talking about Fisher, but before I had Yai rated way higher, but at this point I feel like they are just very close. She is good for similar reasons and even better in Hyper Bloom teams, but Yai absolutely needs to use her burst skill off cooldown and she is extremely energy hungry. In other words, she needs very high artifact quality or she will feel underwhelming. Also, I feel like it is comparable to the Sucrose and Kazuha situation. Doing this just feels more consistent. Child, I think he is a little similar to Venti, as in, I think his damage is absolutely off the charts if you have a lot of targets stacked on top of each other, and it falls off pretty hard if you are fighting a single boss. As opposed to Venti though, his single target damage is still okay, so he isn't as situational. I think he is just a solid main DPS, but in my opinion the extra layer of flexibility on Ayato is just a little more valuable at this point. Rosaria, this character is crazy. First of all, she has great utility, especially for physical teams with Constellation 6, which I believe is what she is currently known for. On top of that, her burst kill actually does really nice damage, and I already talked about how generally that is a good combination. I think she has the potential to be played like a cryo jungling in a way. Unfortunately, Rosaria only has access to melt, unlike jungling who also has vaporize, and I feel like there is no good Pyro main DPS synergy yet. Basically, Rosaria is missing a Pyro Ayaka. Clear is the closest thing we have for her high Pyro application, but her normal attacks are slow and hard hitting. In other words, her skill kit doesn't make any sense. So Rosaria is kind of a prime victim of missing that one great synergy. Though I think she has the potential to be a top 10 character at some point. Nilu, this character is very unique and quite strong, especially if you fight something with innate Hydro auras like Slimes or some Abyss guys to trigger even more Bloom. There really isn't too much to say. Her elemental skill is kind of unique as well, but for most people she is probably just a pure utility character, mainly there for her passive skills. There is one major downside though. Obviously, I'm talking about her insane team restrictions. Having synergies is important to create more depth in terms of gameplay, and the same thing is true for anti-synergy, but the devs went way overboard on this one. Let me just say, I don't see us getting something this restrictive ever again, at least that's what I'm hoping for. Hu Tao, she is the best Pyro main DPS, specifically if you're looking for a hyper carry, but there are some major caveats. Her damage is very much single target, also to play her effectively you need great stamina management to say the least, and probably learn her animation cancels. I used to rate her higher because I didn't see high skill ceiling as a downside, but after getting her Constellation 1 I have to admit it's actually nicer than I imagined. Not only is she easier to play with it, but dash cancelling gets also more viable. One more small thing, you can play around with different elemental reactions and do okay, but realistically Hu Tao has only one team, Vaporize. Shinobu, she is a decent healer, she can be used to enable superconduct for Eula, but the main reason she is here is obviously for being the best finisher for Hyper Bloom. She is super reliable at triggering it, and Shinobu is also not very reliant on her burst skill for both triggering reactions and healing, which means you don't really care for energy recharge either. This makes it fairly easy to even get her above 1000 elemental mastery. Honestly, this is one of the characters that impressed me the most this patch cycle. Baiju, definitely the best Dendro healer. He can even be built as a decent sub DPS. The problem is the utility on his passive skill is completely dysfunctional. I don't understand why it doesn't activate on overhealing, especially since he also provides shields, so more often than not your characters are at full HP and Baiju's passive skill does nothing. This character has so much more potential, what else can I say? Mid-tier, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. These characters are still good, but might just be a little behind in damage, a little niche, or they are great but come with some major drawbacks. First, Alhaitham, he is already an example for the latter. He has pretty good damage, he is kind of the best Dendro main DPS. You could argue Nahida can be played on field, but I imagine most people don't do that. Also, Alhaitham is pretty flexible, you can decide to have very little field time and go for a big burst skill instead. The reason why he is here in the middle is his animations are kind of long, so being animation locked leading to late dodges might happen quite a bit. To me, that's very frustrating, but not necessarily a deal breaker where I would call him unplayable. The Wanderer, Scaramouche. He is actually one of my favorites. He's super fun to play and he has nice consistent damage, but the reason he is here is I feel like his damage output is not quite competitive with a lot of the other characters above and specifically their teams. Just to be very clear on this, I'm talking about a very small difference like 10 seconds in Abyss. Also, I think anemo DPS characters like this need to have slightly higher output in general, since they don't benefit as much from elemental reactions. To be fair, it seems to me though that a lot of the power from this character is locked behind his own 5-star weapon, especially the free 4-star catalyst in comparison don't really excite me, but that also means there's room to grow in the future. Shenhe, I don't think I have to say too much about her. Great utility, but incredibly niche, so realistically I can't place her higher than this. The reason she's up here in the first place is some of her synergies are top 10 characters for me. Toma, he is the best character to trigger Burgeon. He also has some nice utility locked behind Constellation 6, which can make him useful in other teams as well. In general, though, if you slot him in, you likely want him to sustain your team while providing some sort of utility. I think he is good at that, but at best one tier below Zhongli, so he ended up here. Though just to mention it, it's nice to see characters do well after they had a little bit of a rough release. He is kind of comparable to Kokomi in that sense. Eula, she has great one-shot potential with her elemental burst skill, but her teams are also fairly one-dimensional. It's basically always Eula hypercarry with different supports and an electro character to enable superconduct. Also, there are a lot of enemies with high physical resistance, which makes her a little harder to use. As of now, Shatter is basically useless, but I can see a rework benefiting especially Eula to offer a little bit more variety in terms of gameplay in the future. Yoimiya, she is kind of similar to Hotao, as in very much a pyro main DPS with mostly single target damage. Her output seems a little weaker to me though, hence why she is a tier lower. I can see people like her playstyle more though, especially at Constellation 0. Sino, kind of similar to Alhaitham, he has pretty good damage, but again, the whole animation lock thing, especially on his elemental skill, is a little frustrating to me. On top of that, he is also very energy hungry, which kind of locks you into playing aggravate teams for Electro Resonance. Honestly, this placement might even be a little generous. Ito, I think he is pretty good and very fun to play, but he has two problems. One, he is energy hungry, which is especially noticeable when fighting bosses, and two, the obvious one, geo elemental reactions are still garbage and need a rework. To be fair though, he is probably the geo character that cares the least about that, since his main team already has the triple defense scaling geo boys, so there isn't much space left for elemental reactions anyway. But that also means there isn't much variety in terms of teams. Yao Yao, she is a good character, basically the 4-star equivalent to Baiju, though to be clear, she is definitely a budget option. They aren't close, so one tier below she goes. Kiching, this might be a surprise. Her damage is not great, but it's good enough. Mainly, she is just a solid character without many downsides. She doesn't need energy recharge, and now with Dendro reactions, she has more options. The only minor gripe I and many others have with her is the knockback on her charge attacks is really annoying. Peruzan, kind of the same thing as Shenhe, she is really good but incredibly niche, also you kind of want C6. The main problem is her synergies just aren't as strong as Shenhe's, or might even have some design problems, speaking of which. Zhao, I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it, I hate this character, he is still in mid-tier cause his damage isn't bad, especially after Feruzan's release. The problem, designing the burst skill in a way that Zhao can't generate energy with his elemental skill while his burst is active just seems exceptionally incompetent. I'm sorry, usually I don't like to tell people how to do their job, but I can't come up with any good explanation to justify this design choice, especially for a character this dependent on the burst skill. So I can't call it anything else but some of the worst game design I've ever seen. There's also no excuse since they have an older character, Noel, who also has an elemental skill without any energy generation, and the feedback about this was fairly loud at the time. They should have known better by the time Zhao released, in my opinion. Low tier, these are characters who are either incredibly niche while also being fairly easy to replace, or again, they just don't have teams with competitive damage to higher tiers. So it's not like they aren't worth building, but in terms of priority, I see them on the lower side. Albedo is actually a quite good character, he has respectable damage, is super easy to play to the point where I hear people argue that he's boring, and I kind of agree, though I don't think it's necessarily his skill kit. I already talked about it. I think Geo Elemental reactions need a rework really bad. Right now, you just play Mono Geo, cause otherwise Geo just makes other reactions inconsistent. This fact is especially true for Albedo. He has good off-field Geo application and buffs Elemental Mastery. Both of those are fairly useless as of now. If at some point Geo reactions aren't complete garbage anymore, I can almost guarantee Albedo will go all the way up to top tier. Xiangyun, this one actually does quite a lot of burst damage, and he has access to a cryo infusion for any melee character in your team. This is pretty unique, but also makes him quite niche since he might override other elements. Also, to make him really hurt, you kind of need Constellation 6, especially if you want to combo him with Shenhe. I'd argue that his burst skill has even better synergy with Shenhe than Ayaka, surprisingly. And if you think about it, he's kind of a foster version of Ayaka, which can't be a bad thing. I just feel like his elemental skill just needed to do a little bit more for him to be high up in this list. Ningguang, one of my personal favorites, and I hate to see her down here, so I don't want to talk too much about her. At this point, her damage feels like it isn't quite cutting it anymore, and again, geo reactions need a rework. Ningguang could definitely benefit a lot from that. Sarah, she's mainly part of Raiden Mono Electro teams, and granted they are very good, but you need to have C6 or this character is absolutely worthless. Sarah is just extremely niche. Goro, kind of similar to Sarah, as in he has really only one team, Albedo, Ito, and Goro, and you probably want at least Constellation 4, otherwise he doesn't feel too impressive. And to be honest, what you really want is Constellation 6. Mona, this character is the embodiment of the word gimmick. It's the big number screenshot character, but the setup is just way too long to use it consistently. To be fair, she is good in freeze teams, so she also doesn't belong in the last tier. Here she goes. Jean is a solid character, she does good healing, she has interesting applications for high elemental mastery builds mainly in combination with Bennett, and her utility with the Viridescent set is quite decent. She's also a standard 5-star, so you might even unlock Constellation 2 for even more utility. I just think there are way too many good healers at this point, way too much competition. Diona, she is mainly a good cryo battery for Eula, I'd say. For anything else, I feel like she really needs Constellation 6 to bring enough to the table at this point. The Morgana freeze team isn't really a thing anymore. Diona doesn't really feel super relevant at the moment. Beidou, this one definitely has the fun factor with her elemental skill, and her burst skill is quite impressive against multiple enemies. A decent character overall, but realistically, I don't see too many situations where I would actually pick her over another Electro sub DPS like Fisher, so again, too much competition. Tenari, I like him, but realistically, I just don't see him perform as well as Al-Haytham. To be fair, this is at Constellation 0, and he is a standard character, so you might get his constellations naturally, which are actually quite good. It's quite a surprise to me, to be honest. Kirara, similar to Yao Yao, a Dendro character that can sustain your team while also having pretty high Dendro application, though this one provides it while being on field. It's something you just don't look for as often. And her Constellation 6 is actually quite interesting, so this bumps her up a little. Yunjin, she is a little niche, and I think you want to pair mainly characters like Ayato, Yoimiya, or the Wanderer with her, so good characters, but not necessarily amazing. And again, she is Geo. Layla, this is one of two characters I'm not super confident in rating. She has nice off-field cryo application and a shield to sustain your team. I don't have Constellation 4 though, and that grants her some extra team utility that is hard for me to grasp without testing it. I can see that being really good, and when I get there, I might move her up. For now though, here she stays. Klee, in my opinion, she is maybe not dysfunctional in the same sense as Baiju or Zhao, but her skill kit doesn't make much sense. I already mentioned it when talking about Rosaria. Klee does good damage, but having high pyro application and hard-hitting charge attacks is anti-synergistic, which is why she falls behind other pyro characters like Yoimiya. Diluc, he is a decent main DPS, but I just don't see a world where he can keep up with damage. He is a standard character though, so you might get constellations to make up for it. Kea, he isn't really too special, but there just aren't too many cryo sub DPS in the game. He also generates a decent amount of energy. In most cases, you would prefer Rosaria though. Ember, it's hard to get constellations on her, and she only has one good build which requires Constellation 2, and it's extremely gimmicky, way too much setup for most people. The only reason she isn't in last year is for the people who want to point out that she can indeed use Elegy for the end. Most people won't have that weapon though. The last tier, I don't really want to say these characters are all useless, but if you manage to avoid them so far, I wouldn't be too sad for the most part. ... is just how I feel when I pull them. Also, yes, if you really try, you can make any character look good. I don't care. They can't all be winners. Next, Collet, and yes, this character is pretty decent. A decent Dendro sub DPS, nothing too special, not a bad character. I just think there are way too many good Dendro characters for Collet to be placed any higher than this. Mika is a super niche utility character for pretty much just Eula or Razor teams. Also, you really want Constellation 6. And I haven't tested him too much myself, but apparently his skill kit also has some problems. Hazel, decent character, honestly. His damage is just not impressive enough to actually play him as a carry, and his utility isn't good enough to make up for it. C6 does a lot for him though, but I don't have it, so again, maybe in the future I change my mind on him. Kaveh, to be honest, I had fairly high expectations for him, and he kind of disappointed me. He's very energy hungry, his standard application doesn't seem good enough. To be fair, I don't have Constellation 4, but I don't see a world where that's a multiplicative bonus. Also, his regular Dendro core damage bonus from his skills doesn't seem really impressive either. Candace, honestly, she has an interesting skill kit and I like playing her, but realistically, she doesn't do enough. I don't have C6, which again seems interesting for even more Hydro application and obviously damage. Maybe that would change my mind in the future, but I feel like she's just missing some sort of buff for any flat stats like crit damage, Hydro damage, or anything like that. Barbara, I already mentioned it when talking about Kokomi. Wide area Hydro application feels way more valuable these days with Bloom and everything, so Barbara doesn't do a whole lot now other than healing. She can get some utility from different weapons, but there are so many Hydro characters that are just better than her. I don't see her being any higher than this on the list. Yanfei, I rated her really high last time and got called out for it. I argued a lot, but after giving it some thought, I have to admit I grossly overestimated her even back then. Especially at this point, her damage is not nearly enough anymore. To be honest though, I would have liked to have her higher than Klee just to reward better game design, but I don't think I can do that. It's not a good representation of this character. Noelle actually does pretty decent damage, and she can be a replacement for Ito in the defense scaling team. The reason she is 2 tiers below him is her energy generation is completely terrible while she is reliant on her burst skill, and she absolutely needs Constellation 6. Same thing as Zhao, terrible game design. Why do elemental skills that don't generate any energy exist in the first place? I don't understand. Razor, he is a decent character, but at this point his damage is just not very competitive, so I have to put him here. Also, there is a lot of physical resistance on enemies. Kind of funny that he is next to Noel though, since he generates energy exceptionally well. Dory, the second character I'm not super confident in rating. It's the only character I haven't even built so far. I only played her in like trials or events, but I don't want to cop out. Maybe this is a little too low. Maybe Dory is insane with Eula for energy generation. But I just feel like overall Shinobu is just a better pick in almost any situation. Dia. At this point, I think everybody has already hated on her, me included. Just to recap quickly, way too energy hungry, way too low damage, her utility is useless with shields, and she only is good to enable Ganyu. Lisa, same thing as Amber or Kaya, it's very hard to get constellations on her, and she just isn't good enough without them. On paper, her Constellation 6 looks really strong though, but even if you are a whale, you probably need some magic to get there. Shen has very minor utility for physical teams. There is a world where you might use her in Eula teams if you don't have Zhongli, but overall a fairly useless character. Also, looking at her Constellation 6, it actually annoys me. If you want to get defense scaling damage bonus behind Constellations, then why do it for only half the skill kit? At least add it to the burst skill too. It doesn't make any sense, especially since they already got it correct on Noelle before. Sayu, great for exploration, but fairly useless in combat. This is the one character you really want to have, but really don't want to build. And last and very much least, Chi-Chi, great at healing, but nothing else, no damage, her cryo application isn't even decent. Chi-Chi's elemental skill cooldown might just be the highest in the entire game. It only has like 50% uptime, which is almost impressively bad. Alright, just in case it wasn't obvious, I put all characters in specific order within each tier, but it's kind of hard to rate so many, so I could probably keep shuffling them around for forever. The most important thing to me was to have every character in the correct tier, and this is what I ended up with. There you have it. If you watched the entire thing, you probably can't wait for me to finally stop talking, so let's get to the end. I like to read your comments, but I know tier lists always attract a fair amount of toxic people. Again, this is my personal opinion and experience, so don't treat it as anything else. As I said in the beginning, I expect you to disagree with me, but please keep the insults to a minimum. We'll have to call your mom. Alright, stay tuned for the next video. Until then, have fun and bye bye.